When Michael first moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, he believed he had finally found the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. The tree-lined streets, freshly painted homes, and neatly trimmed lawns promised a sense of order and community that he thought he had been missing for years. To him, the neighborhood was not just a collection of houses. It was an investment in peace, security, and stability. But hidden beneath the surface was an authority that would soon turn his dream into a nightmare: the Homeowners Association. At first, the HOA was nothing more than a background presence in Michael's life. Letters about community events arrived in his mailbox, reminders about lawn maintenance were slipped under his door, and the occasional newsletter gave updates on rules that seemed trivial but manageable. He paid his monthly dues without much thought and assumed the association was there to keep things organized. But his perception would change drastically the day he decided to build something he had wanted for years: a shed. The shed wasn't a random whim. Michael had spent years working on woodworking projects, collecting tools, and dreaming of a dedicated space where he could store his equipment. His garage had become so cramped with supplies that his car barely fit inside anymore. A shed in the backyard wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. He researched designs, measured every corner of his property, and made sure that the structure would be both functional and aesthetically pleasing. After weeks of planning, he hired a contractor to bring his vision to life. When it was finally completed, the shed stood proudly at the edge of his yard. With its cedar wood panels, small windows, and sloped roof, it looked more like a cozy cabin than a typical storage unit. Neighbors walking past often admired it, commenting on how well it complemented the rest of the property. To Michael, it wasn't just a shed, it was a personal triumph, a place that represented both his hard work and his passion. But the HOA didn't see it that way. The first notice arrived in a plain white envelope marked with the HOA's logo. Inside was a letter declaring that his shed violated the association's rules and needed to be removed immediately. Michael was stunned. He had reviewed the guidelines before building and found no mention of restrictions against sheds. The rules listed fences, paint colors, lawn care standards, and even mailbox styles, but nowhere had he read that sheds were prohibited. At first, he assumed it was a simple misunderstanding. He wrote a polite letter back, citing the specific guidelines and pointing out that he was in compliance. But days later, a second notice arrived, this one far sterner. The letter claimed his shed was unsightly and diminished property values in the neighborhood. It gave him 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines. Michael's frustration grew. He had built something beautiful and practical, only to be told it was unacceptable. He started to realize that this was more than just a misunderstanding, it was a power play. The HOA board, a small group of neighbors who had taken it upon themselves to enforce every rule with iron fists, seemed determined to make an example out of him. And at the center of it all was the HOA president, a woman named Barbara. She had lived in the community for years and was notorious for her strict interpretations of the rules. Residents whispered about her obsession with control, how she measured lawns with rulers, and issued warnings over minor infractions. To Barbara, Michael's shed was not just a shed, it was defiance as the days ticked by, the pressure mounted. Fines began to accumulate, each one more threatening than the last. Letters came not just by mail, but were also taped to his front door. His once peaceful home now felt like a battleground. But Michael was not the kind of man to surrender easily. He began to dig deeper into the HOA's bylaws, determined to find a way to fight back. Late into the night, he pored over pages of dense legal text, highlighting passages and cross-referencing them with county regulations. What he discovered shocked him. The HOA's own bylaws had not been updated in years. Buried within the old text was a clause stating that any permanent structure required approval from the board, but temporary or movable structures were exempt. And according to county law, sheds under a certain square footage were classified as temporary. Michael's shed, by design, fit perfectly into that category. He realized he had found a loophole, one that could not only protect his shed but also expose the HOA's overreach. The very rules they had been using against him could now be turned back on them. But the battle was far from over. He knew that Barbara and the rest of the board would not back down quietly. They had built their authority on intimidation and control, and they would not tolerate being challenged. As the deadline for removal approached, Michael prepared himself for the storm he knew was coming. His yard became a symbol of resistance, his shed standing tall like a fortress against the constant stream of letters and threats. Neighbors began to notice. Some quietly supported him, tired of the HOA's heavy hand, while others feared the backlash that would come if he won. For Michael, this was no longer just about a shed. It was about standing up to a system that believed it could dictate every detail of his life. He had found the key that could turn the entire situation around, but he also understood that wielding it would come with consequences. The HOA was powerful, and Barbara was relentless. The fight was about to escalate from letters and fines to something much bigger, a battle of law, money, and pride. And as the 30-day deadline closed in, Michael braced himself for the next move, knowing that whatever came next would change his life in the neighborhood forever. The HOA thought they had him cornered, but Michael had discovered their weakness, and he was ready to use it. The 30-day deadline loomed over Michael like a storm cloud. Each morning when he stepped outside, he half expected to find the shed torn down in the night by some order of the HOA. The letters grew sharper, the threats more aggressive. What once felt like an annoyance had now turned into a full-scale campaign against him. Every envelope was printed with red lettering, every notice framed with legal threats. The HOA board had made one thing clear: they would not allow his shed to stand. But Michael had a secret weapon, and he guarded it carefully. That loophole he had uncovered, the distinction between permanent and temporary structures, was more than a technicality. It was a shield, one that not only protected him but revealed how carelessly the HOA had been operating. Their bylaws, dusty and outdated, had never been adapted to county code. It was a glaring oversight, one they never expected a homeowner to notice. Still, knowledge alone wasn't enough. Michael needed to be strategic. If he confronted the board too soon, they might scramble to amend their rules and trap him in a web of bureaucracy. If he waited too long, the fines could spiral out of control, or worse, the board could attempt legal action. Timing was everything, and the board was already circling like vultures. Neighbors began whispering more openly about the situation. Some admired Michael's quiet defiance, secretly rooting for him to stand up against the oppressive board. Others worried that his resistance would bring unwanted attention from the HOA, believing that anyone who supported him might also become a target. The neighborhood, once united by block parties and barbecues, was fracturing into two camps: those who wanted order at any cost, and those who were tired of living under constant surveillance. Barbara, the president, thrived on that division. She was known for walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, jotting down infractions, and issuing warnings like citations. She believed in control, in rules, in the image of perfection. To her, Michael's shed was more than an unsightly structure. It was an act of rebellion, one that threatened the authority she had cultivated over the years. If he won, others might start questioning the rules. The very foundation of her power could crumble. And so, the campaign against Michael escalated. HOA board members started attending his property unannounced, taking photos of his shed, measuring its distance from the fence, and recording every possible angle. Neighbors reported seeing Barbara standing across the street, glaring at the shed as though it were a personal insult. It wasn't long before Michael received yet another notice. This time, a formal demand for removal backed by a threat of litigation. It was exactly the move he had been waiting for. Michael carefully gathered every letter, every notice, and every photograph the HOA had sent him. He compiled them into a folder, organizing them chronologically, noting the escalation in tone and the baseless accusations. Then he included the county codes he had discovered, highlighting the definition that clearly exempted his shed from requiring HOA approval. Finally, he added the section of the HOA bylaws that contradicted their claims. With the evidence in hand, he drafted a formal response. It was not emotional or defensive. It was factual, methodical, and devastatingly precise. He laid out the legal definition of his shed, cited the HOA's own bylaws, and concluded with a notice of his own. Any further harassment would be documented and reported to the county housing authority. When Barbara and the board received the letter, shock rippled through them. They had expected compliance, maybe even fear, but not this. A homeowner using their own rules against them was something they were entirely unprepared for. The board held an emergency meeting, scrambling to determine how to respond. Barbara insisted on doubling down, but some members were hesitant. The evidence Michael had presented was clear, and pursuing legal action could backfire, potentially exposing the board to liability. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Whispers of Michael's letter spread quickly. Some residents quietly thanked him for standing up to the board, relieved to know someone was willing to challenge Barbara's authority. Others worried the conflict would drag on and tarnish the neighborhood's reputation. But no matter which side they were on, everyone was watching closely. The standoff reached a boiling point one Saturday morning when Michael noticed a bright orange notice staked in his yard. It declared that the HOA would be holding a community hearing regarding his shed. Attendance was encouraged, and the notice suggested that residents could voice their concerns. Michael realized Barbara was attempting to turn public opinion against him, hoping that peer pressure would succeed where legal threats had failed. But what Barbara didn't know was that Michael had already taken his evidence beyond the neighborhood. He had quietly contacted a property attorney, explained the situation, and submitted the HOA's letters to the county. The attorney confirmed what Michael already suspected. The HOA was not only in the wrong, but their actions bordered on harassment. If pushed, they could face hefty fines. Still, Michael decided to attend the hearing. He knew the board expected him to crumble under the weight of community pressure, but he had no intention of bowing to them. Instead, he prepared to let them dig their own grave. On the day of the hearing, the room filled quickly. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, murmuring as Barbara and the other board members took their seats at the front. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Some came out of loyalty to Barbara, others came to support Michael, but most came because they wanted to see a showdown. Barbara opened the meeting with her usual authority, presenting the shed as a violation that needed to be corrected. She emphasized property values, community standards, and the importance of following rules. She painted the shed as a threat to the neighborhood's image, as though its cedar panels and tidy construction were an eyesore dragging everyone down. Michael sat quietly, waiting. He didn't need to interrupt or argue. He had already planted the seeds of doubt. When his turn came, he stood and calmly presented his evidence. He read the exact wording of the HOA's bylaws, then cited the county regulations. He showed how his shed met every requirement, how it was exempt from approval, and how the HOA's demands were baseless. Finally, he reminded the board of their responsibility to act within the law, hinting at the consequences of continued harassment. The room shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, some nodding in agreement, others whispering among themselves. For the first time, Barbara's authority seemed fragile. Her arguments, once accepted without question, were now being scrutinized. The board ended the meeting abruptly, claiming they needed to review the matter further. But everyone in that room knew what had just happened. Michael had stood up to the HOA and exposed their weakness. And as the crowd dispersed, Barbara's glare said it all. The battle was far from over. She wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. The weeks following the community hearing were filled with a strange, tense silence. Michael knew better than to believe it was over. Barbara's expression at the end of that meeting had said everything. Her pride was wounded, her authority undermined. She wasn't the type to simply accept defeat. For someone like Barbara, being challenged wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. And insults demanded retaliation. At first, the signs were subtle. Michael noticed his trash cans mysteriously tipped over on collection day, their contents scattered across his lawn. Then, anonymous complaints began to appear in his mailbox. Claims that his grass was too long, his holiday decorations too distracting, his car parked at the wrong angle. Each complaint was written in the same sharp, officious tone, but without official HOA letterheads. It was clear Barbara was rallying her supporters, weaponizing petty grievances in an attempt to overwhelm them. Michael kept meticulous records of everything. Every notice, every suspicious action, every photograph. He knew the value of documentation, and he refused to give the board an opening. His lawn was trimmed, his car parked precisely, his property maintained to perfection. If Barbara wanted to catch him in violation, she would have to invent something outright. And that, Michael suspected, was exactly what she was willing to do. Sure enough, another letter soon arrived. This one was official, stamped with the HOA seal and signed by Barbara herself. It claimed his shed was a nuisance structure, not because of bylaws or county regulations, but because it allegedly attracted pests. The letter stated that multiple residents had complained about seeing rodents near his property and accused the shed of being the cause. If he didn't remove it, the HOA threatened to hire exterminators and bill him for the cost. Michael almost laughed when he read it. His shed was sealed, meticulously cleaned, and raised slightly off the ground to prevent exactly that kind of problem. It was an accusation built entirely on fiction. But to Barbara, facts no longer mattered. She had moved beyond rules and into the realm of manufactured narratives. Once again, Michael prepared his counterattack. He called a licensed pest control company and had them inspect his yard thoroughly. The inspector found no evidence of rodents, issuing a written report declaring the property pest-free. Michael added the report to his growing file of evidence. But Barbara wasn't satisfied. If she couldn't tear down the shed directly, she would try to make Michael's life miserable in other ways. HOA board members suddenly began driving slowly past his house at all hours, cameras in hand, snapping photos of everything from his driveway to his mailbox. Neighbors who had once waved politely now avoided eye contact, fearful of being caught on the wrong side of Barbara's campaign. Michael's home, once a refuge, had become the epicenter of neighborhood drama. Then came the fines. Despite his compliance, the HOA began issuing daily penalties, small amounts at first, but quickly snowballing into hundreds of dollars. They claimed the fines were for non-compliance with community standards, a vague accusation that provided no specifics. It was harassment in its purest form, designed to break his resolve. Michael, however, refused to crack. He contacted his attorney again, presenting the new wave of harassment and fines. The attorney smiled knowingly, explaining that this was exactly the kind of abuse of power that county courts took seriously. In fact, if the HOA continued down this path, they could be liable for thousands in damages. Word of the conflict spread even further. Some neighbors began quietly siding with Michael, emboldened by his resilience. They shared their own stories of unfair fines, of Barbara's intimidation, of the board's overreach. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now being spoken aloud. A movement was beginning to form, though cautiously, as most feared retaliation. Barbara sensed her grip slipping, and it only fueled her desperation. She doubled down, calling for yet another special board meeting to discuss disciplinary measures against Michael. Flyers were slipped under doors, urging residents to attend and preserve the integrity of the community. To Barbara, it was a war of optics, a chance to reframe Michael not as a victim, but as a troublemaker who threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. Michael prepared carefully. He had already won the first round with his loophole, but now he needed to expose the HOA's tactics in a way that left no room for doubt. He organized his evidence into binders, each tabbed and highlighted, showing the harassment step by step. Letters, inspection reports, photographs, legal definitions, even recordings of board members loitering near his property. It was all there. The night of the meeting arrived, and tension hung heavy in the air. The community center filled with residents, their faces a mix of curiosity, frustration, and apprehension. Barbara sat at the front, her expression smug but strained, as though forcing confidence she didn't truly feel. The board members flanked her, some looking stern, others clearly uneasy. Barbara opened the meeting with fiery rhetoric, accusing Michael of undermining the HOA, of wasting community resources, of being a divisive presence. She spoke of order, unity, and standards, framing herself as the protector of the neighborhood. For a moment, her words seemed to resonate with a portion of the crowd. But then Michael rose. Calm, steady, and armed with the truth, he began presenting his evidence. One by one, he dismantled every accusation. He displayed the county inspection report, proving the shed was pest-free. He showed the vague and baseless fines, exposing them as harassment. He played recordings of board members photographing his property without cause. He laid bare the timeline of intimidation, each piece undeniable. The room shifted. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Neighbors who had once been skeptical now leaned forward, eyes wide. Even some board members exchanged uneasy glances. The picture was clear. This wasn't about a shed. It was about power, abuse, and a board president who had overstepped her authority. Barbara's face grew red, her composure cracking as the weight of the evidence settled in. For For the first time, she found herself on the defensive, scrambling to explain away what could not be explained. Her words faltered, her authority crumbling under the scrutiny of the very people she had ruled over for years. By the end of the meeting, the room was no longer united behind her. Residents whispered of audits, of elections, of removing board members altogether. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and Michael had been the one to sow them. But even as he left that meeting with the crowd buzzing, Michael knew the battle was not finished. Barbara was humiliated, and humiliation breeds vengeance. He had stood his ground and won another round, but he could feel it. The storm was only growing stronger, and when it broke, it would shake the entire neighborhood. Barbara's humiliation at the community meeting did not weaken her resolve, it sharpened it. To someone like her, the embarrassment of being exposed publicly was more than a setback. It was a wound to her pride that demanded retribution. And if the HOA's usual tactics had failed to bring Michael down, then she was prepared to escalate in ways few neighbors could have imagined. The days that followed grew increasingly hostile. Michael noticed unfamiliar cars idling near his home at odd hours, their occupants snapping photos before driving off. His mailbox began filling with anonymous notes, handwritten threats calling him selfish, urging him to leave the neighborhood, accusing him of ruining the community's reputation. While the handwriting differed, the intent was clear. Barbara had rallied her loyalists into a shadow campaign of intimidation. Michael's response was steady and meticulous. Every note was photographed and filed, every incident logged with time and date. He knew this pattern well. Push harder, force a mistake, document everything. He understood that Barbara's desperation would eventually cause her to cross a line, and when she did, he would be ready. The breaking point came one afternoon when Michael returned from work to find a notice taped to his shed itself. In bold lettering, it declared the structure condemned by the HOA and announced that demolition was scheduled within 10 days. The notice claimed the shed posed structural dangers and health risks, citing no inspection, no report, no evidence. It was a threat not just of fines, but of physical destruction. Michael knew instantly this was Barbara's boldest move yet. The HOA had no legal authority to demolish private property without a court order, yet here they were, threatening to send contractors onto his land. This was no longer harassment. It was trespassing, vandalism in the making, and a blatant violation of property rights. He didn't waste a moment. His attorney was contacted immediately, and within days, a cease and desist letter was sent directly to the HOA board. The letter was clear and damning. Any attempt to demolish the shed would result in immediate legal action, including claims for damages, harassment, and violation of state property laws. Copies of the letter were sent not just to Barbara, but to every member of the board, making it impossible for them to claim ignorance. But Barbara, blinded by pride, refused to back down. She convened yet another emergency board meeting, this time behind closed doors, excluding residents entirely. Rumors swirled through the neighborhood. Some said Barbara planned to authorize contractors anyway. Others whispered about raising HOA dues to fund legal action against Michael. The secrecy only fueled distrust, and for the first time, Barbara's iron grip on the neighborhood began to crack. Michael, meanwhile, strengthened his position further. He filed formal complaints with the County Housing Authority, attaching copies of the demolition notice and documenting the HOA's escalating harassment. He also contacted local media, carefully framing his story as one of a homeowner bullied by an overreaching HOA. Though no article had yet been published, he knew the threat of publicity alone would put additional pressure on the board. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, a neighbor who had always kept his distance knocked on Michael's door. Nervous, but resolute, the man explained that he had been pressured by Barbara to sign a petition against Michael's shed. When he refused, Barbara allegedly threatened him with fines over a minor landscaping violation. The neighbor had come forward not out of friendship, but out of frustration. He too had grown tired of the intimidation. And he wasn't alone. Over the next week, several other neighbors quietly approached Michael, sharing their own stories of harassment, manipulation, and arbitrary fines. One had been forced to repaint his house 3 times in 5 years because Barbara didn't like the shade. Another had been fined for having too many guests at a holiday party. Each story added weight to Michael's growing case. Barbara, oblivious to the tide turning against her, pressed ahead with her demolition threat. Flyers were slipped under doors announcing that the shed removal was for the good of the community. She framed Michael as reckless, selfish, and combative. Yet her words rang hollow now. Too many residents had experienced her wrath firsthand, and they began to see Michael not as a troublemaker, but as the first to openly resist. When the demolition date arrived, Michael was ready. He had already arranged for his attorney to be present, along with a county inspector and even a local news crew tipped off about the controversy. Cameras were set up, documents in hand, witnesses prepared. What Barbara intended as a show of power was about to backfire spectacularly. That morning, a contractor's truck pulled into the neighborhood, summoned by the HOA. But before a single tool could be lifted, Michael's attorney stepped forward, cease and desist order in hand, warning the workers that any action on the shed would be illegal trespassing subject to criminal charges. The county inspector backed him, declaring the shed fully compliant with safety standards. The contractors, unwilling to get caught in a legal battle, packed up and left before Barbara could stop them. And the cameras caught everything. The footage of an HOA president attempting to demolish a perfectly legal shed against the homeowners was more than just a local curiosity. It was the kind of story that spread fast. Within days, clips appeared online, shared across social media platforms, painting Barbara as the face of petty HOA tyranny. The backlash was immediate. Angry emails flooded the HOA board, demanding Barbara's resignation. Residents began openly discussing a recall election, emboldened by the public humiliation. Even board members who had once stood firmly by Barbara now distanced themselves, fearing the legal consequences and the growing unrest in the neighborhood. Michael had not only protected his shed, he had turned the tables completely. Barbara's overreach had handed him the very weapon he needed, undeniable proof of abuse of power. But while Barbara's grip was slipping, Michael knew she wasn't finished yet. People like her rarely accepted accountability willingly. She might have been cornered, but a cornered opponent is often the most dangerous. The battle had escalated beyond neighborhood squabbles. Now it was about legality, money, and reputation. And Barbara was about to discover that every move she made would only tighten the noose she had unknowingly placed around her own neck. Barbara's failure to demolish the shed was a turning point, but instead of admitting defeat, she dug her heels in deeper. To her, the embarrassment wasn't just personal, it was catastrophic. She had ruled the HOA for years, issuing orders with absolute authority, and most residents had complied without hesitation. Now, one man had not only defied her, but exposed her abuse of power to the entire community and beyond. For Barbara, survival meant doubling down. The neighborhood was buzzing with fallout. The footage of the attempted demolition had spread quickly, not just online, but through local news outlets. The image of contractors retreating under the watchful eyes of lawyers and inspectors had become a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach. Reporters now knocked on doors, asking residents for their opinions, and though some still clung to loyalty, many voiced their frustration with Barbara's leadership. Michael's phone rang constantly, neighbors calling, journalists requesting statements, even strangers from other communities sending words of support. He declined interviews, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. His focus was on the legal battle now brewing in the background. His attorney had already filed complaints with the county, and the housing authority had launched an investigation into the HOA's conduct. Behind closed doors, the board was in disarray. Minutes from their meetings, later leaked by a sympathetic board member, revealed growing divisions. Some wanted Barbara to resign quietly to avoid further scandal. Others feared that her removal would destabilize the HOA and open the door to lawsuits. Barbara, however, refused to consider stepping down. She insisted the shed was a symbol of rebellion and that allowing Michael to win would destroy the order she had built. Michael kept gathering evidence. He knew Barbara's refusal to back down meant she would slip again, and when she did, he wanted to ensure there would be no escape. He documented not just her actions against him, but also the testimonies of neighbors who had suffered under her rule. Fines for trivial issues, threats of lawsuits, even accusations that she selectively enforced rules against people she disliked. All of it was compiled into a growing case. The HOA's retaliation shifted gears once more. Notices arrived demanding back dues that Michael supposedly owed, fabricated charges with no basis in his payment history. His checks had always cleared, his receipts carefully stored. It was a blatant attempt to create financial leverage. But Michael anticipated it, pulling out bank records and receipts that proved every cent had been paid. Each false charge only added fuel to the case against the board. Meanwhile, the housing authorities' investigation moved forward. Inspectors interviewed residents, requested records, and reviewed years of fines and enforcement actions. The picture that emerged was damning. An HOA that had consistently overstepped its authority, issuing fines arbitrarily and enforcing rules selectively. The shed was merely the latest example in a long pattern of abuse. Then came the letter that changed everything. Delivered by certified mail, it announced that the housing authority had found the HOA in violation of multiple regulations. The fines imposed on Michael were illegal, the attempted demolition unauthorized, and the harassment unlawful. The HOA was ordered to cease all actions against him immediately and was warned of heavy penalties if further violations occurred. Michael read the letter with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. It was the validation he had been waiting for. But even more importantly, it wasn't just about him anymore. The findings opened the door for other residents to come forward with their own complaints. And they did, quickly and in large numbers. Barbara's power crumbled in real time. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke out at meetings, demanding accountability. Petitions circulated calling for her removal. Even her allies on the board began to distance themselves, worried about being dragged down with her. Barbara's once commanding presence was now overshadowed by whispers, glares, and outright hostility. Yet Barbara remained defiant. She continued to insist that Michael had exploited loopholes, that he was undermining the community, that everything she had done was for the greater good. But her words fell flat. The evidence was too strong, the residents too fed up. What had once been fear of her authority had turned into resentment and ridicule. Michael, though vindicated, stayed cautious. He knew the HOA was cornered, but a cornered opponent was dangerous. Barbara still held the gavel at meetings, still controlled the board's correspondence, and still believed she could win by sheer force of will. He braced himself for one final act of desperation. It came in the form of a lawsuit. One morning, Michael was served papers claiming he had defamed the HOA by speaking out and damaged property values by refusing to comply with their orders. The lawsuit demanded tens of thousands in damages and threatened to drag the conflict into a drawn-out court battle. But Barbara's gamble was doomed from the start. The same evidence that had protected Michael before now shielded him again. His attorney swiftly filed a counterclaim, not only defending him but demanding compensation for harassment, emotional distress, and legal fees. What Barbara had intended as her final blow became the very trap that ensnared her. The case moved quickly, accelerated by the weight of evidence against the HOA. The judge, unimpressed by Barbara's flimsy claims, demanded documentation of all fines, enforcement actions, and communications. What emerged was a paper trail of abuse that left little room for doubt. Arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, threats of illegal action. It painted a picture not of a fair and reasonable association, but of a petty regime run on intimidation. Barbara sat in the courtroom, her once commanding aura reduced to silence. She could no longer hide behind vague notices and intimidating letters. Here, under the scrutiny of the law, every move she had made was laid bare. And as the proceedings dragged on, it became clear the HOA wasn't just going to lose. They were going to pay. The courtroom was packed on the final day of proceedings. Residents from Michael's neighborhood filled the benches, some curious, others quietly hopeful that justice would finally be served. At the front sat Barbara, rigid in her chair, her expression a mix of indignation and fear. She had fought to maintain control for months, but here, in the stark atmosphere of the court, her power meant nothing. All that mattered now was the evidence. Michael sat beside his attorney, calm and steady. He had spent countless nights preparing, organizing every document, every notice, every shred of proof that showed the HOA's relentless harassment. The binders stacked neatly on the table were more than paperwork. They were a record of Barbara's downfall. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, methodically dismantling Barbara's claims. The supposed fines Michael owed? Fabricated. The accusations of pests? Unsubstantiated. The demolition notice? illegal, and the lawsuit itself, an act of retaliation with no legal standing. One by one, every argument Barbara tried to cling to was torn away, leaving nothing but the undeniable truth: the HOA had abused its authority. When the ruling was delivered, the weight of it echoed through the courtroom. The lawsuit against Michael was dismissed in its entirety. The counterclaim, however, was upheld. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for harassment, legal costs, and emotional distress, a sum that reached into the tens of thousands. On top of that, the Housing Authority levied fines against the HOA for regulatory violations, penalties that would drain the association's funds for years to come. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as residents turned to one another, whispering in disbelief. For so long, Barbara had seemed untouchable, her authority absolute. But now, stripped of power and faced with financial ruin, she sat pale and silent. Her once commanding presence was gone, replaced by the image of a leader who had finally been held accountable. Michael, though victorious, felt no joy in watching her unravel. He hadn't sought this war. It had been forced on him by her obsession with control. All he had ever wanted was to enjoy his home, his shed, his peace. Yet through her arrogance, Barbara had turned a simple backyard structure into a neighborhood scandal that ended in legal defeat. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread quickly. News of the case circulated beyond the neighborhood, picked up by local papers and even regional broadcasts. The story of one homeowner standing up to a tyrannical HOA struck a chord with audiences everywhere. Michael's shed became a symbol of resistance, proof that ordinary people could fight back against overreach. Within the neighborhood, change came swiftly. Barbara resigned as HOA president under pressure, her reputation shattered. Board members who had supported her stepped down, either out of guilt or fear of being dragged into further legal troubles. A special election was held, and for the first time in years, residents felt they had a real say in how their community was run. The new board promised transparency, fairness, and respect for homeowners' rights, values long absent under Barbara's reign. As for Michael, life slowly returned to normal. The constant stream of notices stopped, the unmarked cars disappeared, and the whispers of harassment faded into memory. His shed stood exactly where it always had, unbothered and untouched. It became more than just a place for his tools. It was a monument to perseverance, a reminder that even when the odds seemed stacked against him, he had refused to be bullied into submission. Neighbors who once kept their distance now approached him with gratitude. They shared how his fight had given them courage, how his victory had freed them from years of silent resentment. Some even admitted they had considered moving away to escape Barbara's grip, but now, with her gone, the neighborhood felt like a place worth staying in again. Barbara, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. Rumors circulated that she had moved away, unable to face the humiliation of living in the very community she had tried to dominate. Her name lingered only in hushed conversations, a cautionary tale of how power can corrupt and how arrogance can destroy. For Michael, the battle had been exhausting, but it had also taught him a valuable truth. Standing up for what is right often comes with a cost, but the reward is freedom. Freedom from fear, from intimidation, from control. His shed had been the spark, but the real fight had been about something much bigger: the right to live in peace without being crushed under unnecessary rules. Months later, as he stood in his backyard, the evening sun casting golden light over the cedar panels of his shed, Michael allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. What had begun as a simple project had turned into the defining struggle of his life in the neighborhood. He had faced threats, harassment, and legal battles, but in the end, he had stood tall. And the HOA? They had tried to demolish his shed, but they were the ones who ended up destroyed instead.